Homelander had been standing on the roof of Vought Tower for 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes he had not moved once, which was unusual enough that the 3 junior employees who noticed it through the glass did not report it because reporting unusual behavior from Homelander was the kind of career decision that ended careers. He was looking at something on the street below. Not someone causing a scene, not a threat, not anything that should have held his attention for 11 seconds, let alone 11 minutes. Just a man in a yellow coat eating a sandwich. Vought has survived congressional hearings, underground supervillain networks, and a literal coup attempt from inside its own ranks. But nobody in that building, nobody on that board, nobody with a Compound V contract and a marketing deal and a kill order on standby has ever had to write a protocol for this. Subscribe and hit the bell right now because what happens next is going to rewrite both universes permanently. The surveillance system that Vought International had built over the preceding decade was not publicly acknowledged to exist, which was standard practice for a corporation that had learned early that the most useful tools were the ones nobody was looking for. It ran across every major city in the country through a network of facial recognition nodes, embedded in infrastructure that the cities themselves had been paid to install, without being told what the secondary function was, cross-referencing in real time against a database that contained not just known superhumans and persons of interest, but anyone who had ever been flagged by any Vought contractor for any reason across any of the 17 countries where the company had active operations. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the most comprehensive civilian surveillance apparatus in private hands anywhere on the planet, and it had been running without a significant gap or unexplained failure for 4 years and 8 months. It failed to categorize Saitama in the first 6 seconds of contact, and had been failing continuously for the 11 minutes since. This was not the same as failing to detect him. The system detected him fine, logged his position, tracked his movement through the street below Vought Tower with the same mechanical thoroughness it applied to everyone else. The failure was categorical. Every person the system processed received a threat assessment score between 0 and 100, generated by an algorithm that weighed physical indicators, movement patterns, biometric data, proximity to known Vought assets, and 17 other variables that the engineers who built it had decided were sufficient to describe the full range of human and superhuman threat potential. The score informed everything downstream, whether a response team was dispatched, whether a file was opened, whether a name went on a list that had consequences attached to it. Saitama's score was returning as a formatting error. Not 0, not 100, a formatting error. The kind of output a system produces when the input it has received does not fit inside the data type it was designed to process. The way a calculator displays an error when you ask it to divide by 0, not because it is broken, but because the answer exists outside the range of numbers it was built to display. The analyst who first noticed this spent 40 minutes assuming it was a software issue before escalating it, and the person she escalated it to spent 20 minutes on the same assumption before pulling up the raw sensor data and looking at what was actually being collected, and what the raw data showed was not a glitch. The sensors were functioning perfectly, the data was clean, the algorithm was running correctly, and the output it was producing was a formatting error, because the numbers the algorithm was generating for this particular input were larger than the field allocated to display them, which was a situation the engineers had not considered it necessary to design, for because the field they had allocated was large enough to contain any value the algorithm could theoretically produce for any entity that had ever existed. Up on the roof, Homelander had not looked away from the street once. He had abilities that no surveillance system needed to mediate. His vision cut through the distance and the glass and the angle between them, and showed him the man on the street in the kind of detail that made distance irrelevant. And what he saw was a person eating a convenience store sandwich with the focused attention of someone for whom the sandwich was currently the most important thing happening, which it probably was, because nothing about this person's behavior suggested they were aware of being watched, or would have particularly cared if they were. The thing that had stopped Homelander was not what his eyes were showing him. Eyes were just optics. He had learned a long time ago that what his eyes collected and what his instincts processed were sometimes running completely different analyses of the same situation. His eyes showed him an ordinary man eating a sandwich. His instincts, which had been calibrated over years of being the most dangerous thing in every room he entered, were running something closer to an emergency protocol, a low, continuous alarm without a specific trigger, the kind of alert that a system sends when it detects that the environment has changed in a way it cannot yet fully describe. The small detail nobody would film, his laser vision, which activated involuntarily when his emotional regulation slipped, was flickering at the edges of his eyes. Not firing, not building towards something visible, just flickering. The physical tell of a man whose body was reacting to something his pride had not yet given his mind permission to name. He was unsettled. Homelander was unsettled by a man eating a sandwich on a public street, and the part of him that had spent his entire existence being certain that nothing outside of his control could reach him was very quietly, very carefully, beginning to understand that something had changed in the world without asking his permission first. The file that Ashley Barrett received at 6:47 the following morning was not routed through the normal channels, which was the first thing that told her it was serious, because the normal channels existed precisely to create the appearance of normalcy around things that were not normal, and whoever had compiled this had decided that the appearance of normalcy was not worth maintaining around whatever this was. It came directly from the head of Vought's Threat Intelligence Division, a man she had spoken to maybe 4 times in her career, a man who did not send files directly to the CEO's office unless the alternative was worse than whatever conversation the file was going to start. She read it twice before her coffee was finished, and then she sat very still for a moment in the way that people sit still when their brain is processing something faster than their body has decided to respond to it. The file contained everything the surveillance network had collected on the individual flagged as subject unlabeled, which was the designation the system had defaulted to when it could not complete a categorical assessment, and it contained the results of 48 hours of additional manual analysis conducted by 3 of Vought's senior intelligence contractors working independently of each other, each given the raw data without context and asked to produce an assessment. The fact that they had been kept independent was itself a methodology choice that told Ashley something about how seriously the division head was taking this, because independent parallel analysis was a protocol reserved for situations where the stakes of a wrong conclusion were high enough to justify the redundancy. All 3 assessments had arrived at the same place through different routes, which was either reassuring in the sense that the conclusion was probably correct, or deeply not reassuring in the sense of what the conclusion actually was. The subject demonstrated no measurable compound V presence in any biological signature the sensors could collect at range. No elevated cellular regeneration markers, no energy output consistent with any known superhuman ability category, no anomalous readings of any kind that the sensors were designed to detect. And Vought's sensors were designed to detect everything the company had ever encountered across 30 years of creating and cataloging superhumans, which was a range that covered abilities from the trivial to the catastrophic, clean across every metric. Biologically unremarkable in every way the instruments could measure. And yet, the gravitational sensors, a secondary system installed not to monitor people, but to monitor structural integrity of Vought-adjacent buildings, a precautionary infrastructure tool that nobody had expected to contribute to a threat assessment, had logged a persistent low-level anomaly in the immediate vicinity of the subject during the entire period of observation. Not a reading that corresponded to any known physical phenomenon. Not an error. A consistent, stable, real reading that the sensor was producing accurately, and that the analysts had no framework to explain, which one of them had described in their report with the specific reluctant precision of a scientist writing something they know sounds wrong, as though the space the subject occupied was heavier than the space around it, not in a way that affected anything observable, but in a way that the instruments could detect, and that suggested the subject's presence had a relationship with the physical environment that fell outside the parameters of normal matter. The second anomaly was simpler and more disturbing for its simplicity. Every animal within a 2-block radius of the subject, dogs on leashes, pigeons on ledges, a rat that a street camera had caught mid-crossing, had moved away from him. Not in a panicked way, not in the dramatic manner of animals responding to a predator they had identified. Just quietly, steadily, with the unhurried deliberateness of creatures that had made a collective calm decision that the space near this person was not a space they wanted to occupy, and had acted on that decision without urgency, because urgency implies a threat you might outrun. And whatever this was, it was not something they were entertaining the possibility of outrunning. Ashley put the file down on her desk and looked at the window for a moment, and then picked it up again, and looked at the photograph the surveillance system had captured, the best resolution image from the 48-hour observation period. A man in a yellow coat with a cape that was slightly frayed at the bottom right corner, looking at a convenience store shelf with the expression of someone who cannot decide between 2 flavors of instant noodle. She called the head of intelligence back and asked one question: whether the 3 independent analysts had been told about each other's conclusions after they submitted their reports. He said no. She asked what happened when they were. He was quiet for exactly long enough that she understood the answer before he gave it, which was that all 3 of them had asked, unprompted, and using almost identical phrasing, whether Vought had a contingency for a situation where the subject could not be neutralized. Ashley looked at the photograph again, the frayed cape, the instant noodle deliberation. She told him to get Homelander on the phone. The unexpected detail that lands in the chest rather than the head, on the desk beside Ashley's coffee, a small succulent she had been keeping alive for 2 years through careful and consistent attention, was sitting in its pot completely unbothered, and she noticed it for no particular reason in that moment, and felt, briefly and without rational basis, envious of it for not having read the file. The meeting lasted 19 minutes, which was longer than Homelander usually permitted things that bored him to last, and shorter than Ashley had prepared for. And the reason it ended at 19 minutes was not that a conclusion had been reached, but that Homelander stood up, which in any room he was in functioned as the meeting's ending regardless of where the conversation was. He had listened to the intelligence briefing with the particular quality of attention he deployed, when something was activating the part of him that he kept carefully managed in professional settings. Not the performed attentiveness of someone pretending to care, but the tight focused stillness of someone receiving information that is touching something real underneath the constructed surface. The way a wire carries current invisibly until it reaches the thing it was always traveling toward. What the briefing told him, stripped of its analytical language and its careful hedging, and the institutional caution of people who understood that delivering bad news to Homelander required a specific kind of packaging. What it told him, underneath all of that, was that there was something in his city that his abilities could not fully read, and that Vought's instruments could not fully categorize, and that every animal in a 2-block radius had quietly decided to give a wide berth to. And that this thing was currently living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a mid-density residential neighborhood, and appeared to be, by every behavioral indicator available, completely unaware that any of this attention was being paid to it. Homelander did not share the information about the 11 minutes on the roof. He had already decided, in the way he decided things that touched the part of him he did not put in front of other people, that the 11 minutes were not something that existed in the official version of this situation. The official version was that the intelligence division had flagged an anomaly. The CEO had been briefed, and he was now handling it with the decisiveness that the situation required, which was the version that maintained the correct relationship between all the relevant parties and did not include any information about flickering laser vision and an unsettled feeling that had followed him through the previous night like a sound he could not locate the source of. What he told Ashley was that he would make contact, not a team, him personally, which she pushed back on with the careful indirectness of someone who understood that direct pushback was not a survivable strategy, suggesting that perhaps a more measured initial approach involving observation and data collection before any direct engagement might allow them to. And he looked at her with the specific quality of look that ended that sentence before it reached its conclusion. He told her the reason he was going personally was the same reason you do not send a junior employee to handle something that might require authority. That whatever this was, it needed to understand from the first moment of contact what the hierarchy of this situation was, and that hierarchy was communicated most efficiently by the person at the top of it showing up directly. This was a reasonable argument. It was also not the real reason, and Ashley knew it was not the real reason, and Homelander knew she knew, and neither of them addressed the layer underneath because the layer underneath was that Homelander needed to stand in front of this person and feel what his instincts felt in that proximity, needed to run his own assessment with his own senses rather than through instruments and analysts and reports, needed to know whether the unsettled feeling that had followed him through the night resolved into something manageable when the distance collapsed, or whether it did something else, something he did not have a prepared response to yet. He needed to know if he was afraid. Not in the intellectual sense. He could acknowledge the intellectual possibility in the privacy of his own processing without it costing him anything. In the physical sense. In the sense of standing close enough to something that the body makes its own assessment independent of what the mind is telling it, and finding out what that assessment is. He flew out of the building without taking the elevator, which he did sometimes when he wanted the exit to make a specific kind of statement about the conversation being conclusively over, and the air pressure in the conference room shifted noticeably when he left in the way it always did, that brief equalization of a space that had been oriented around a gravitational center and was now recalibrating to his absence. Ashley sat in the conference room alone for a moment after he left and looked at the wall and thought about the photograph of a man deliberating over instant noodle flavors and felt the specific texture of a situation that had moved past the point where her decisions were the ones that mattered, which was a feeling she had developed a complicated relationship with over the years of this job. Not acceptance exactly, but a working arrangement with the reality that some variables were outside her management scope, and the best she could do was be positioned correctly for whatever came after. She opened her laptop and began drafting a crisis communications framework for a scenario she typed as subject unlabeled, public incident. And she started with the section on narrative control, because narrative control was always the first thing to establish and the hardest thing to recover once it was lost. And she had learned that lesson more times than she had wanted to, and was not interested in learning it again. Outside the window, somewhere over the city, Homelander was already moving. Saitama was in the middle of deciding whether the supermarket 2 blocks further had better prices on beef than the one he was currently standing outside of when the shadow fell across the sidewalk, which in his experience meant either a large cloud or someone who wanted to make an entrance. And he had learned over years of hero work that the ones who led with shadow were usually the ones who had decided in advance how the interaction was going to go and needed the staging to feel correct before they could begin it. He looked up without urgency, with the mild readiness of someone who has learned that urgency is a resource, and spending it before the situation requires it is wasteful, and found Homelander descending from about 40 feet up with the particular controlled slowness of a landing that was designed to be watched rather than simply accomplished. The civilians on the street responded the way civilians in this universe had been conditioned to respond to Homelander, with the complex mixture of genuine awe and carefully managed fear that years of Vought marketing had refined into something that looked, from the outside, almost entirely like admiration. People stopped walking. Phones came out. Someone said his name in the tone of a person confirming to themselves that the thing they were seeing was real. The street reorganized itself around his presence, the way streets do, when something arrives that the people on them have been taught to treat as categorically more significant than themselves. Saitama watched him land and waited. Homelander straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and which the suit and the cape and the years of practice using both had taught him to present as even more considerable than it was. And he looked at Saitama with the expression he used for situations that required him to establish dominance quickly. Not aggressive, not warm, but the specific calibrated neutrality of someone communicating through bearing alone that the terms of this interaction were already decided, and the other party's role was to understand that. Saitama looked back at him with no particular expression at all. This was the moment that Homelander's instincts had been waiting for, the moment when proximity would either resolve the unsettled feeling or clarify it. And what it did was neither of those things. What it did was intensify. The low, continuous alarm that had been running since the roof now running at a frequency that his body was having to work to keep below the threshold of visible response. The fine muscles around his eyes and jaw doing small, involuntary things that he was suppressing with the practiced control of someone who had spent decades learning to manage his own physical tells in front of cameras and crowds, and people looking for weakness. He said, in the tone that closed press conferences and ended conversations with senators, that Saitama had been drawing attention. Saitama said he had not been doing anything. This was completely true and somehow the most disorienting response available, because the script that Homelander had run through on the way here, the possible responses, the likely postures, the ways this could develop, had been built on the assumption that the person on the other end of this conversation would have a position, would be performing something, would be oriented toward this interaction in some way that gave him angles to work with, and the complete absence of performance. The total lack of any apparent awareness that this interaction was supposed to be significant left the script with nothing to push against. He asked Saitama who he was. Saitama told him he was a hero. Not a licensed hero, not a Vought hero, not qualified with the specific institutional language that this universe used to determine whose heroism was legitimate and whose was a liability, just a hero, stated with the same weight as someone answering what do you do for work at a party, no more and no less than that, as though the word needed no apparatus around it to mean what it meant. Homelander looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment something that was not quite discomfort and not quite recognition moved through his face before the controlled neutrality reasserted itself. And the thing that moved through it was this: the awareness, arriving without invitation, that he was looking at someone for whom the entire architecture of power that he had spent his life building and defending and weaponizing simply did not register as architecture at all, did not read as something to navigate around or position oneself in relation to, existed in the same category as weather or gravity, which was the category of things that simply are and that you either accept or exhaust yourself fighting. The detail nobody would catch on camera, Homelander's cape, moved slightly in a wind that had died 3 seconds earlier, still carrying the momentum of his landing. And in the moment before it settled flat against his back, it briefly wrapped forward around his left side in a way that looked, just for that half second, less like a symbol and more like something trying to hold itself together. He told Saitama not to cause problems. Saitama said okay, and turned back to the question of whether the further supermarket had better beef prices. And the conversation was over in the way that conversations are over when one participant has departed from them while still physically present. And Homelander stood there for 3 seconds longer than he needed to before he rose back into the air. And the civilians took photographs of his ascent with the same enthusiasm they had documented his descent. And nobody on that street, except one of them, understood what had just happened. The unsettled feeling did not resolve on the flight back. It got heavier. Huey had been running the recording for the 4th time when Frenchie leaned over his shoulder and said, quietly, and with the specific tone of someone who had seen enough genuinely dangerous things to have calibrated their alarm system accurately, that this was different. Not different like a new Vought asset they had not cataloged yet. Not different like a soup with an ability outside the normal parameters. Different in a way that Frenchie, who had a gift for identifying the essential nature of a threat before he could fully articulate why, was finding difficult to put precise language around, which was itself the most alarming thing about his assessment because Frenchie always had language for things. The recording was from a street camera 2 buildings down from the contact point, pulled from the city's infrastructure network through a backdoor that had spent 3 weeks building access into and had been invaluable on 4 separate operations since. The angle was not ideal, but it was sufficient. Sufficient to show Homelander land. Sufficient to show the conversation. Sufficient to show the thing that had made Huey run it 4 times. Which was not what was said and not what was done, but the quality of Homelander's body during and after. The microscopic tells that years of studying the most dangerous person alive had taught him to read the way a sailor reads water. Homelander was unsettled, not performing confidence over acknowledged fear, the way he sometimes did when a situation was genuinely challenging but recoverable. This was the other thing, the thing Huey had only seen twice before in all the hours of surveillance footage he had processed, which was Homelander encountering something that his threat processing system could not fully resolve, and having to continue operating while that unresolved processing ran in the background. Visible only in the specific quality of stillness he used when he was suppressing something, and in the 3 seconds he stood on the ground after the conversation ended before he chose to leave. Billy Butcher watched the recording once and said nothing for a long time, which was more alarming than anything he could have said, because Butcher's relationship with silence was the same as his relationship with most things he found threatening. He filled it, covered it with noise and forward motion, and when he did not do that, it meant the thing in front of him had reached a depth that his usual approach did not have the tools to address. Then he said he wanted to know everything about the man in the yellow coat. Not surveillance, not data, everything. The kind of everything that required actual proximity, actual conversation. The kind of intelligence that cameras and sensors could not collect, because what he needed to understand was not what this person did but what this person was. And those were different questions that required different methods. Pointed out, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to deliver practical objections to Butcher without it sounding like opposition, that approaching an unknown with that power profile directly and without preparation was the kind of decision that generally preceded the kind of outcomes they were specifically trying to avoid. And Butcher said he knew that. And said, so what was the plan? And Butcher said the plan was that he was going to go talk to him. What Butcher did not say, what he kept in the part of himself that he did not put in operational briefings, was that the footage had done something to him that he needed to address before he could think clearly about the tactical picture. Because watching Homelander stand in front of another person and flicker, watching the most feared thing in his world run its emergency protocol and come back with an unresolved result, had produced in his chest a feeling that was almost indistinguishable from hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing Billy Butcher ever let himself feel, because it was the thing that had cost him the most, historically, when it turned out to be wrong. He needed to know if it was wrong before he built anything on it. So he went to find the man in the yellow coat himself, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, with no weapons he was willing to name out loud and no plan beyond starting a conversation and seeing where the person on the other end of it actually was. He found Saitama at the further supermarket, standing in the meat section, holding 2 packages of beef and looking at the price per gram on each with the focused attention of someone doing genuine arithmetic. And Butcher stood at the end of the aisle for a moment and took him in, the ordinary coat, the unremarkable height, the complete absence of anything that the eye could catch and call dangerous, and felt the same thing Homelander's body had communicated in the footage. The low-frequency signal that existed below rational processing, the animal layer saying something that the human layer had not caught up to yet. He walked up and said, in the tone he used when he wanted to sound like he was not assessing someone while assessing them completely, that the one on the left was better value. Saitama looked at him and then looked at the packages and then put the right one back and said thanks, and Butcher thought, in that half second between the thanks and whatever came next, that this was either going to be the most important conversation he had ever started or the last one, and that the only way to find out which was to keep going. The small observation that lives outside the frame, Saitama's basket, sitting on the floor beside him while he compared packages, contained instant noodles, 2 onions, a single can of beer, and a small toy figurine that he had apparently picked up from a clearance bin somewhere in the store, the kind of small plastic thing that costs $2 and has no practical purpose, and that a person buys because something about it appealed to them in passing, and they did not overthink it. And looking at that basket, Butcher felt something shift in his understanding of the situation that he could not immediately explain and did not try to, just filed it and kept going. The thing about a Pyrrhic victory is that it does not announce itself as one while it is happening. It looks like winning, moves like winning, produces all the external indicators of winning, and the realization that something was lost in the process arrives later, quietly, in the specific aftermath silence when the momentum has stopped, and you are left standing in what remains and doing the accounting. Butcher spent 3 weeks talking to Saitama. Not interrogating, talking, which for Butcher was a skill he had developed out of necessity rather than inclination. The ability to be genuinely present in a conversation while simultaneously building a structural understanding of the person across from him, cataloging not just what they said but the shape of how they said it, the things they did not say, the places where the language and the reality underneath it did not fully align. He was good at this. He had used it on politicians and psychopaths and everyone in between, and the intelligence it produced had been operationally significant more times than he could count. With Saitama, it produced something he had not been prepared for, which was clarity without the usual complexity underneath it. The man was exactly what he appeared to be, not simple, not unaware, not lacking the capacity for depth, but genuinely, structurally uncomplicated in the way that things are uncomplicated when they have been reduced to their essential nature by a process that removed everything peripheral. He had trained until the training broke every limit his body had, and then kept training. And what was left after that process was a person who had no performance left in him, because performance requires an audience, and Saitama had long ago stopped being able to locate an audience that could evaluate what he was doing in any way that mattered to him. He was not a weapon. He was not an asset. He was not a variable that could be introduced into a strategic situation and directed toward an outcome. He was a person who hit things that needed hitting and went home afterward and thought about what was for dinner, and the gap between what that sounded like and what it actually meant in practice was the entire distance between the world the boys operated in and something else, something that did not have an institutional category yet. The operation that ended Vought, not damaged, not exposed, ended. The corporation ceasing to exist as a functional entity over the course of 11 days in a manner that the news covered as a financial and regulatory collapse, and that anyone paying closer attention would have recognized as something more surgical than that, did not involve Saitama in any direct way. He did not storm buildings, did not appear on camera, did not become the story. What he did was be present twice, at moments when the operation's survival required something that the boys did not have the capacity to provide themselves. And in both of those moments, he was there because Butcher had asked him, and he had said okay with the same weight he gave everything, which was the weight of genuine agreement rather than obligation. The victory was real, the thing they had been working toward across years of loss and damage, and the specific grinding cost of fighting a war against something that controlled the narrative was real, finished, done in a way that did not leave a path back to what it had been. Butcher sat in a room 3 days after the end and felt none of what he had expected to feel, which had always been the risk of building a life entirely around a destination. That arriving stripped away the momentum that had been the only thing making the journey bearable, and what was left without it was just a room and a silence, and the full unmediated weight of everything the journey had cost. Starlight was rebuilding something from the institutional remnants, working with the same focused determination she brought to everything, translating the collapse into a foundation for whatever came next. Was home, actually home, in the way he had been trying to get back to for years, and the fact of it sat on his face in a particular way that people who had known him through the worst of it could recognize as the specific relief of a man who had not been certain he would get there. Frenchie and Kimiko were somewhere in Europe, which was where they needed to be, doing whatever came naturally to two people who had survived things together that created a grammar between them that only they could speak fluently. The boys were done. Not dead, done, which was the outcome they had been trying to reach and which had seemed, for most of the time they were trying to reach it, like the kind of goal that existed to give direction to effort rather than as an actual destination that could be arrived at. Butcher found Saitama at the further supermarket on a Thursday, because Saitama had apparently assessed the beef prices and made his determination and was loyal to it now. And he stood at the end of the aisle the way he had stood there the first time, and watched him compare packages with the same focused arithmetic, and felt the full complexity of what 3 weeks of genuine conversation had produced, which was something he did not have a clean word for, and was not going to pretend he did. He had spent his entire adult life in proximity to extraordinary power, and had never once encountered it without an agenda attached. Not Vought's version, not the Seven's version, not even his own, which had been the most honest version available and had still been power in service of a direction, power as a means toward an end. Saitama was the first person he had ever met for whom power was simply a fact about themselves, like height or handedness, not something they had built an identity around or deployed toward a purpose or needed anyone to acknowledge. The small final detail: Butcher bought the beef on the left that day, the one Saitama had originally been considering, for no reason he could have defended under questioning, and for every reason that mattered to him privately. And he carried it home through a city that was in the early, uncertain process of figuring out what it was now that the thing organizing it for 30 years was gone. And he cooked it badly, because he had never been good at cooking, and had never had sufficient reason to get better. And he ate it alone in his flat, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure. Outside the window, somewhere in the city, a man in a yellow coat was probably doing the same thing. The same nothing, the same alone, the same Thursday that was just a Thursday because all days were just days when you had stopped needing them to be anything else. Butcher had won. He was still figuring out what he had lost to do it.